That is my favorite subject of all time. It is the DB2 relational database trigger programs. In fact, trigger is not quite the correct word. It's triggered. Because the programs that we are talking about here are triggered by the relational database management system on a particular event. Triggered programs can be written in any language you choose, as long as, in my case, it's RPG. They are high performance because they run in the memory pool, in the machine pool, under the operating system priorities. And as a result, they are highly optimized. And we will talk about the difficulties that can occur if you overestimate the abilities of a trigger. But triggered programs are an integral, significant part of a modern database. And properly utilized within the database, they can reduce, and you will not believe this number, but it's true. They can remove between 40 to 60% of all the lines of RPG code in your application. Because 40 to 60% of the lines of RPG code in your application have to do with one of two things: database validation or database synchronization. In both cases, a combination of triggers with constraints will remove between 40 and 60% of the code that you currently have in your application programs. Of course, having done that, you have 40 to 60% less lines of code to test, which means your testing is a lot easier as well. And you have 40 to 60% less lines of code to maintain, should you wish to upgrade your application. So the knock-on benefits are extraordinary. I cannot talk enough about triggers. And in fact, this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about at Wisconsin in March, the user group there, because they are my favorite toy of all times. Right, let's proceed to look at where they fit into the whole picture. You have a program, which is a program within an application. It's a client program, and then that program requests or asks for service from the RDBMS, the management system, relating to a table. Now, the RDBMS, of course, has access to the jobs PAG, where the file definition tables are stored. And so it can determine from the PAG, and I should have had the slide, but I think you can probably remember it, because the table definition contains the trigger definitions. So the RDBMS will examine the PAG, look for the file definition table, and determine whether, in fact, there are any triggered programs involved in this particular request from the program. If there are, the RDBMS will do a number of things. The first thing it will do, it will apply the requested insert, update, or delete to the table. It will then look and see which triggered programs have been defined. And it will pass a call to the appropriate triggered programs in a specific predefined order, and will process the responses from those triggered programs before actually finally returning control to the application program. So there's a lot that goes on between the request to insert a record, for example, and the actual return which says your record was successfully inserted. But that's where it happens. It happens within the relational database management system. And the definitions of those triggered programs are defined with the table. I'm going to pull this in. Little green screen, which I'll probably make bigger so you can see it. Add pftrg is the command that will allow you to add a trigger to a file. That is the command that allows you to do it. So, getting rid of that and going on to the next slide, I want to talk about what events can be triggered. And this is a table that illustrates the events that can be triggered. There are three categories or classes of triggered events. There's the before class, which is before the update is actually confirmed to the table, i.e. insert, update, or delete is confirmed to the table. There is the after class, which are used and called after the insert, update, delete has been applied to the table. There is also an additional triggered event there called read, which is called, if present, by the after class of triggers. I've used that once, and I'll explain its use in a little while. It's actually not used very often. Then with version 6.1, we had the third class of trigger being attached. It's an instead of trigger. Insert, delete, and update. And it is applicable and is usable only on SQL logicals. It is a SQL set of triggers. And for the purposes of this session, I'm not going to discuss the instead of triggers unless there's a very, very specific request for it, because it's SQL based and there are other ways of achieving the same result without having to learn a completely new skill set. A maximum of 300 trigger programs are allowed per file. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, that one has also gone up. I think it's about 2,000 now, if I'm not mistaken. However, discussing whether it's 300 or 2,000 is rather irrelevant, because I promise you, you're not going to add 300 triggers to a file, let alone 2,000. Let's have a look at what happens when a client application requests an action on a table. Now, it can be an insert, a delete, or an update, or in the case of an after trigger, it can be a read as well. Before the update to the table, or the insert, or the delete is actioned, if a trigger has been defined for that class or event or for time and event, if you look at it here, you will see there's a trigger time, before, after, and there's a trigger event, insert, update. So that's where you create a link to tell the relational database management system that you are attaching a program. There's the name of the program and its library to a physical file for that particular time and event. So you, as the database architect, attach triggers to files. And those triggers point to a program. I will talk about some of the other parameters just now. AO allows you to define these triggered events and manages them for you, i.e., it applies them and manages them for you in order to keep the database correct and properly defined. The one thing that is a high-risk issue with triggers is they will be called if the definition exists. But if somebody disables or removes the definition, then whatever that trigger was supposed to do is not being done. So the actual attachment of the trigger to the file is a very important issue. Let's have a look at the before class. Before insert. If a program is attached to the before insert event, it will be called if the client attempts to insert a record into the table. And here I'm talking about every client. I'm not only talking about your application, your production system. I'm talking about every single client, because the relational database management system and its associated triggers care not one little bit for the program or client that is requesting the activity. The only thing they're interested in is the file on which that activity is being performed. So it works for every client, including DFU, DBU, and any SQL client you can think of. The same thing will happen for the table every single time. So if a program is attached as a before insert, there, then before the insert is finalized for the table, control will be passed to the program that is defined for that event. If the event was a delete and there was a program, mouse writing is not my best skill in the world. Or mouse drawing, shall I say. And of course, you also have an update. So whichever is the event that has occurred or that has been requested by the client, the program associated with this particular before insert, delete, or update is actually called. Now, I usually create a single program as a before trigger, BT, for each one of these events. So each one of these events is linked to a single program. I have a single program that caters for all three before time events. And there's a very, very simple reason for that. Before triggers are primarily designed to validate information or data before it is allowed to go into the table in the database. That is the typical requirement or action of a before trigger. And of course, the validation that is performed by that before trigger is, generally speaking, exactly the same whether you do an insert or an update. So instead of having those business rules written into two different programs, we write the before business rules into a single before trigger program that is attached to all three events. You'll actually find that the delete event is more often than not attached because there's no validation that needs to be done with the delete event. If you have your referential integrity correct, you don't need to check to see whether the dependent file has records in it. The constraint will do that for you. So the more common is to have a before trigger program attached to the insert and the update events. But occasionally there's a need to attach one to the delete event as well. And I will show you examples shortly of trigger programs and how they handle this request for a before, update, insert, or delete. Once the before trigger, if applicable, because if it's not defined, it's not called. But once the before trigger has been called, it can respond in one of two ways. It can respond without comment. If a before trigger responds to the database management system without comment, then the database management system proceeds with the next step, which is to insert, delete, or update the record on the table. But not to commit it. Then it will go and look for any after events. Insert, delete, or update, or read. If there are programs attached, and I generally, once again, have a single program for the after trigger events, and there might be attachments again. Read is very rare. It's used on a very, very specific occasion when you want to suppress a user's ability to read certain records out of a file. So the after event will essentially call an after trigger. Now, an after trigger, whereas a before trigger is designed to do primarily to do validation of data coming in and to provide proper defaults and to add user ID and last change date and all that sort of stuff. That happens before you finally insert, update, or delete, whereas the after trigger is much more concerned with the synchronization of the database files. And an example of this would be if you had a file which was a summary file of a transaction file, i.e. the transaction file was summarized by customer, by month and year, for example. It's a small example, but it's fairly common. We mostly build that summary file at day-end batch run by reading all the transactions for the day, summarizing them, and updating or inserting them into the summary file. In the case of using triggers, an after trigger would in fact maintain that summary file one event at a time, which means that you reduce the need for doing that during a batch job at night. Now, let me tell you, the performance is beyond reproach, and quite honestly, to do this type of thing, you will users will not even notice a performance degradation within the database. It just doesn't happen. So the after triggers are generally synchronization triggers or audit information collectors. And this is important. You can also, I know that a lot of you probably process journals in order to extract information for audit reports. That is time-consuming. It requires a complex journal management procedure. And if for some reason one journal receiver goes missing, you lose that information. So rather than use journals, I use after triggers. I call them change collectors. It's a specific type of after trigger that collects changes to the files in the form I want them for my audit reports or my analysis or my tracking. And of course, you can switch them on and off as you want, if you want them only to be temporary. So those are the two, the before triggers, mainly for validation, the after triggers mainly for synchronization. But, and this is a big point, it's not limited to that. I have used before and after triggers for some of the most extraordinary things that are an easy way to satisfy a requirement that a customer has or a user has without going into long, complicated batch or interactive processes. Because remember, a before and an after trigger already divides itself up into insert, delete, update. And it is a single record process, i.e., you don't have to code for multiple records. You code a trigger for single record action because a call to a trigger only processes one record. Okay, so before we move towards looking at some actual examples of triggers and finding out what all the bits and pieces of triggers are, I am going to move back